Hi there, it's Cale. I have to quickly remind you that this episode deals with spoilers for the Watchmen comic book, the TV show, and the movie. You've been warned. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to Matt and Cale Read Comics. Every episode, Cale and I are going to read a different graphic novel and discuss it, look at the choices the cartoonists make in the creation of the graphic novel, and talk about what that impact has on us as readers. My name is Matt Smith. I'm a Canadian cartoonist and comics educator, currently living in Glasgow, Scotland.
Hi, and I'm Cale Wericke. I'm a longtime mainstream, quote-unquote, comic book fan, cosplayer, collector, and former filmmaker. Teach me about comics, Matt.
Yeah, so I guess we'll start by acknowledging that Cale's tastes are very mainstream. You know, you read comics purely from an entertainment standpoint. Is that fair in saying that, Cale?
Yes, definitely. I like pretty pictures.
So I enjoy mainstream comics. I love a good superhero comic, but I also really like looking at the craft of comics and the medium of comics and really examining what can be done storytelling wise and just the things that can be only done and only achieved through comics. So we wanted to start this podcast to kind of take a deeper dive into some comics and hopefully look at some new comics. But for our first episode, we chose Watchmen, which is one of my favorite graphic novels of all time. Cale, what's your relation to this book?
Well, I mean, I've always been a fan of superheroes, and so for me to kind of read a book that deconstructs the superhero myth, that's pretty interesting. And I mean, recently I've been even watching The Boys on Amazon, and that is like a modern deconstruction of superheroes as well. So it's really interesting to kind of take a look at basically takes on similar types of characters, and we can get into that in a bit. But when you think of like classic superheroes like Superman and Batman, how would that actually relate to real life or anything else? So we can talk about that, I guess, as the episode goes along.
Yeah, I mean, the word deconstruction is great because that's really what. So just to get everyone on board, if you haven't read Watchmen, obviously highly recommend it, and it's one of the books that I usually give to people that aren't maybe so familiar with comics. I've given it to a lot of kind of first-time comics readers, and it's, I think, very accessible to people that are comic fans, or maybe this is their first introduction to the world of comics and the world of superheroes. But the story is about this group of characters, and it asks the question, what if superheroes were real? And it takes place in an alternate 1985, where superheroes have existed since the 1930s, and they've kind of impacted and affected history. And then there was a large group in the 1970s that were eventually banned by the government. And now the story is in 1985, and there's sort of former and outlawed superheroes. We follow characters that include Night Owl, the Silk Spectre, Ozymandias, Dr. Manhattan, who is the only character in this story who actually has any real superpowers. Everyone else is just kind of a masked vigilante, kind of like Batman. And there's also Rorschach, who's investigating the death of the comedian, and that's what opens the story. And during the course of Rorschach's investigation, there's this larger sort of conspiracy against the superheroes past and present that comes to light. And I mean, it's really hard to describe just what Watchmen is because there's just so much packed into these issues. It was originally printed and published as 12 issues and then collected into this graphic novel. And even that summary there just only kind of hints at this larger world, which is one of the things that's just so great about it, is there's just so much going on, so much content, so much story. And it's just, you can spend so long just looking at a page because there's just so much in every panel. So it's written by Alan Moore and the art by Dave Gibbons. And they worked very, very closely. There's lots of collaboration. I have this book, Cale, I think you need to check out. It's called Watching the Watchmen. I have it in front of me, and it's got just so many notes and sketches and the thumbnails for the entire series, but it just really shows how much back and forth there was. But they really wanted to build this world. And so looking at any page within any panel, there's so much background detail that kind of hinted at what an impact these superheroes have had on the course of human history. So this 1985 is so far removed from our own 1985 because we've had these mass adventurers, these superheroes existing since the 30s, but also Dr. Manhattan existing and changing technology and changing the progress of human achievement. And I want to talk about the layout. Did you notice that the entire book, Cale, is drawn on a grid?
I actually didn't think about it till you
Yeah,
mentioned it, and I was like, I'm looking at the comic right now, and I'm like, oh
yeah.
yeah, of course. It is like a perfect grid every panel, and it's. What do you think is the kind of important part or the meaning behind the grid pattern?
Yeah, so just to explain people that maybe don't have the book in front of them, the entire story was drawn on this 9 panel grid. So if you look at any page, there's not necessarily 9 equal panels, but even if a page has kind of a longer horizontal panel, it really is 3 of those little panels broke or added up together. So, it's 3 by 3, 3 rows of 3 columns and 3 rows of 9 panels per grid, or they're combined to make longer horizontal ones, kind of a widescreen. But if you look at it, really, the entire story is drawn on this grid. And I mean, the reason they did that is, number one, they wanted to kind of create this sort of steady rhythm, this steady tempo as you're reading, and then when they do break from that 9 panel grid, maybe they have like a larger panel that is more surprising. It does kind of tell you, okay, this is something that's important. There's a reason we're breaking this tempo. But I mean, just looking, Dave Gibbons also has another fantastic book called How Comics Work. And I'm just looking at what he said here, and they really wanted to break away from the sort of, he calls it poster layouts that were popular in the US comics. So, I mean, one of the things Cale and I talk about is his, you know, strong loyalty towards very image based, splashy American kind of style comics, where every layout is kind of like bombastic and crazy, and just like, this panel explodes into this panel. And that can detract from the reading order and the rhythm of reading. And they really wanted this to stand out and be something different and not be this sort of in your face, very bombastic. And so they wanted this sort of basic grid, but also I know how much detail they wanted to put into every page. And if they were spending time not only adding that detail and developing the characters, but also redesigning the page every time, like it would have killed Dave Gibbons. So knowing that he had this, this basic grid work to work with, that saved him a lot of time when it came to designing each new page. So there's a lot of reasons for it, but it definitely is one of those things. Once you see it, you can't help but see it. And for me, I know when I pick up a book, I do kind of look, okay, what's the underlying structure? And if I ever see a 9 panel grid, I get excited and I'm like, oh, it's Watchmen, it's the Watchmen grid. And it's kind of, like recognizing an old friend. It's very geeky, but I get very excited over that.
How do they actually, for me, I was looking at the lettering itself,
Yeah.
and how do they, fit everything in those little cells? It's something, I don't know, like I'm so used to like good, splash pages with,
Mhm.
lots of room where people can actually write like tons of dialogue, or even
Yeah.
sometimes dialogue that flows from panel to panel. But here it's so contained, and I'm like, how did they do that, right? Like when you're a writer, how do you think in like smaller uh, panels or smaller
Yeah.
pieces of text?
Well, I know just from this watching the Watchmen book that Alan Moore does do little, very, very ugly, rough thumbnails as he's kind of plotting out. And he's also got a book called Writing Comics with Alan Moore, or Alan Moore's Writing Comics. It's something like that. And he talks about like his quote unquote rules, and he broke down how many. He's like, people are asking me for the rules. So 23 words per panel. There's something like he pulls numbers out of nowhere and just says like, this is probably the maximum per panel and maximum per page, maximum per balloon. So he does have kind of what he knows will be too much per page or per panel even. But to answer your question, part of the reason, or part of the, to make it fit, when you draw comics, you draw it at about 1.5 times the size. So, even when we buy these comics that are, more or less a skinnier A4 sort of page size, they're drawn on like tabloid A3 size. So you do draw much bigger, which allows you to get a bit more detail in, and then it kind of tightens everything up when you downsize it for the print size. But also, it's not so common anymore, but Dave Gibbons did all the lettering himself. So if you look
Oh
at
man.
the rough
Hmm.
pages, the pencil pages, he
Hmm.
goes in and he puts in the words, and then he puts in the balloons, and then he knows how much space is left for the art. And this is one thing that, like, as I mentioned at the start of the episode, I'm a comics educator as well, and this is like the number one thing that I drive home with my lessons is add the words first in every panel. Take the time to think about what's being said, if there's any narration for caption boxes or any thoughts and thought balloons, or sorry, thought bubbles, speech balloons. Write that all out first. Then you know how much space you have left for the art. And the fact that Dave Gibbons did his own lettering, he knew exactly how much space he had left for every one of these panels. So that's how it just, it's so symbiotic and it works so well. You're right. They get a lot of words in, a lot of details, but it all works together because he was placing it all on the page and inside each of those panels.
So for whatever reason, in my mind, I was thinking that the art came first and then the lettering, and that was the order. Especially like in mainstream comics, I thought that like the art would come first and then it would be sent to the letterer who would put it together. This is so interesting that Dave Gibbons did it himself.
Yeah,
and, I mean, I used to draw comics as well. I used to have a webcomic for about 7 years, and I did it that way, like the old way, or maybe the Marvel method. I'm not sure, whatever it's called. But in my mind, I was like, oh yeah, I'll just draw it first. And then I'll put in the lettering later and kind of make it work somehow. Yeah, that's how I made it work.
I know from your comics, your Plot Pulse webcomic that you used to have, you left quite a bit of space above the characters' heads in the background. So you did kind of hedge your bets with space for those balloons.
That's correct.
But to go back to like the process, I mean, really, there's no right way to make a comic. Any style that works for you kind of does work. And when you're working with, multiple people doing the writing, penciling, the inking, the lettering, the coloring, it is more of an assembly line, and the artist wouldn't necessarily do the lettering, but they do need to know how much space to leave. So they, will rough it out, and then someone else will come in and do the lettering. But as far as the art coming first, the writing coming first, obviously this was scripted by Alan Moore first, but then Dave Gibbons would go and do what are called thumbnails. So these very, very small, rough drawings where he figures out what the art is. And the book, Watching the Watchmen, one of my favorite parts is he's got literally every thumbnail for the entire book. You can see it as this very, very rough, I wouldn't even call them stick figures, it's kind of blobby figures, a bit of facial detail, but just these very, very rough characters on the very, wonderful 9-panel grid where he doesn't write out the letters, but he's got these kind of balloons with kind of lines. So he knows, okay, this character is saying about this much, I'll just rough it in. And then when he goes to the actual pencils, he'll go back to doing the lettering first, kind of at least roughly, to know how much space to leave. So it is kind of, chicken and the egg, words, then pictures, words and pictures at the same time. But the one thing that I really like, I'm just looking at a spread of a bunch of his thumbnails, is even at the thumbnail stage, he's got these heavy, heavy areas of dark, solid areas of black. And I love that he really concentrates, even at this very early stage, on the solid areas of black. And it's so overlooked, the importance of solid black in comics, because without it, sometimes I heard a cartoonist say that it looks kind of like unfinished coloring book art, when everything just has an outline and no black shadows and no solid black just to give it a bit of depth and shape and form and weight. But I just love that Dave Gibbons is thinking about his solid areas of black, even at this very rough stage.
Yeah, I like the plot because it takes place between multiple time periods, and like, I think that speaks to Dr. Manhattan as a character, because for him, time it's all happening at once, and free will is just an illusion, right? So it kind of mirrors that kind of point of view.
Yeah, and that's really interesting you said that, because I wanted to bring that up, that Dr. Manhattan, there's one issue that's devoted to Dr. Manhattan sort of, recounting his origin, and he does say, like, it's happening at the same time. I'm in this moment, I'm decades in the past, I'm in the future, I'm at all moments simultaneously. But it speaks to one thing that I've heard Alan Moore talk about, where he says, yes, you're supposed to read a comic in sequential order, but you're holding this book and there's nothing to stop you from flipping backwards. And, especially with Watchmen, where there's so many things that connect to something you would have read, 3 pages ago, 3 issues ago, 3 chapters ago. So you are kind of reading the comic, and it does kind of exist as, this one story, but also simultaneously. And there's nothing to stop you from jumping backwards and connecting panels to a page, several pages back, and a panel on there. And that is kind of how Dr. Manhattan experiences time. And I think that's just really cool that Dr. Manhattan experiences time as a comic book almost. And he is able to, essentially flip back a couple pages, flip back a couple chapters, and skip ahead. And I think that's just really cool that that is paralleled into the way that he experiences time.
That's really interesting because I never actually thought about that. Is this part of the breakdown that you got from your watching the Watchmen book, or?
I think I heard him talk about it before in another interview, and
Oh, I see.
Alan Moore is a big component to the power of comics, and he famously hates all of the adaptations. And we'll talk about the adaptations maybe a bit later. But one of the reasons he hates adaptations is because you lose something in that translation, and that's one of the things he talks about that you lose this ability to kind of control your reading, and
Mm-hmm.
not even just that flipping back and forth, but controlling the pacing of the reading. Which there's so many things you can try and do as a cartoonist to control how your reader gets information, and one of those choices is the grid layout and how many panels per page. But really, there's nothing to stop you from Dr. Manhattaning the book and jumping around.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I wanted to actually get into the characters themselves, and when
Yeah.
when I was reading them, I automatically did some comparisons.
Yes.
Between like Dr. Manhattan more being like Superman, then like the owl being more like the classic Batman, the 60s Batman with like the
Yeah.
gadgets and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
For Silk Spectre, at least it is Wonder Womanish in my mind, but at the same time, she hasn't really in this comic. I've read somewhere that Silk Spectre wasn't given that much
No.
time to develop as a character, and she basically doesn't want to be a superhero. So that's makes her more of like the point of entry maybe into this world as like a normal person. So yeah, I think there are a lot of cool dynamics in this comic that I'd like to get more into, actually.
Yeah, well, let me just say that, one of the famous, urban legends, I mean, it's been pretty much proven, but part of the genesis for this project was DC Comics acquired the rights to the Charlton Comics characters. So, I mean, the only one I really kind of knew of, or there's three that I've kind of seen because they've been, properly incorporated into the DC universe. There's Blue Beetle, The Question, and Captain Atom. So Alan Moore knew that they had these characters they had to bring into the DC universe, and he said, okay, I'll do a new story, and I'm going to kill one of them, and then there's going to be a conspiracy, and at the end, half of them are going to be dead, and the other half are going to be, completely emotionally destroyed and shattered and give up superheroing altogether. And DC was like, well, no, we just bought these characters. If you destroy them emotionally or physically, then we can't use them again. So he's like, okay, fine, I'll just make up new characters. So Night Owl is actually based on Blue Beetle, and there were two Blue Beetles. So in this story, there was the original Night Owl, and then we have the secondary Night Owl, who's kind of a legacy character. Silk Spectre was based off a character called Nightshade, who I've never really seen much for. Ozymandias is based on Thunderbolt, who I'm not familiar with. Rorschach is based on The Question, who has been more integrated into the DC universe. The Comedian was actually based on the Peacemaker, and then Dr. Manhattan was based on Captain Atom. But
I see.
I very much agree with you that Dr. Manhattan being the only superpowered character in this world, it allowed, I think, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons to play around with a lot of Superman ideas, like what if Superman did exist? And their answer, really, which I find fascinating, is, well, he just wouldn't care about humanity. He'd be so powerful and so removed that he's so detached, and he just doesn't. And he has to find a reason to care and actually get involved in the story near the end.
Exactly, and I I found it funny that Dr. Manhattan is kind of not very good at like human things, like even sex, right? Like he's just so in his own world because he exists in basically all of time. Like for him, his perception is so skewed that like for him to start a relationship, he knows how it's going to end. Yes. So he's just like, why should I even care? Right.
Yeah.
So
no. And it's interesting that like, why would he care about us? No, like, he's just on a different plane of existence. But I think it's interesting that you think the Comedian connects to Batman for you, because I saw Batman, and again, Batman is one of my favorite characters of all time. But I
Hmm.
see Batman kind of influences in Rorschach being this sort of very street level vigilante, but he's kind of a very hard lined, very very black and white Batman, who's already already accused of being a black and white character to begin with, but he is very very my way or the highway Batman. And then
Yeah,
also Night Owl with, like you said, all the toys and the technology and the different gadgets, and everything is based around his animal theme. So he's got like his do they call it the owl cave? Essentially the owl cave or the owl's nest, I
exactly.
think it was called. And then he's got his owl ship, Archimedes. Archimedes? Archimedes.
Archimedes, yeah.
Yeah, Archie. So,
Yeah.
but I mean, I think that's part of the appeal of this is taking these archetypes and yeah, okay, what would the Batman character be like in this universe really, and what would a Superman-like character be in the real world really. So
Exactly.
I think that's definitely intentional that they're pulling on these archetypes for us to connect to. Who's your
Totally.
favorite character?
I think it is Night Owl and
What?
Silk Spectre too. Okay, I'm gonna explain. I'm gonna explain. It's because for me, the two characters are the more relatable, normal people in the
Mm-hmm.
book, compared to somebody like Rorschach. Rorschach is like he looks at the world in black and white, and so his moral compass is very like I would say stringent or very constricted. The comedian reminds me of the Punisher
Yes.
than any other character. So, but yes, I would say that because of that human connection between Night Owl and Silk Spectre 2, where they're trying to have a relationship, and
Mm-hmm.
he is just like a normal guy, and he has like uh, I don't know, he has issues with like even like intimacy, and he's just
Well,
like,
that's the fascinating thing. They all have their massive character flaws, but
mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
mean, his is obviously the most relatable. I think just he's a regular dude trying to stand shoulder to shoulder with these larger than life characters. But yeah, sorry.
No, no, I agree. And I think that's what makes him more human is that he questions himself,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why I find that I identify with him more than any other character. I feel like I was like rooting for him and for Laurie, just
Mm-hmm.
to have like a normal life. And we can definitely talk about the ending later, but that's something that helped me relate to the material and also kind of keep reading. Like I we've spoken before about other books where I felt like I didn't really connect with the characters, and I'm like, okay, I gotta just kind of slog through it. Here, I did not do that at all. I was like, oh great, like I want to see what happens to these people, right?
Yeah.
And I'm rooting for them. I want them to do well. So I think that's really important.
I think you're 100% correct that these are, you said it before, like our entryway characters. Night Owl, and I think it needs to be acknowledged that Night Owl is a big geek. He's a big nerdy fanboy who grew up seeing these superheroes in real life, and he was a big fan of the original Night Owl and said, "Hey, I want to do that when I get older." And he is, just playing dress up really, and he's one of the first. He's one of the ones who kind of takes retirement the easiest. Rorschach doesn't retire. Comedian goes to work for the government. Dr. Manhattan can't retire because he's basically a person of mass destruction that becomes, the government's weapon. But Night Owl he's a fanboy. He's, the main target audience of these books. So that makes sense that he is very much the entry point and the gateway character. And Silk Spectre, she inherited that name. She inherited this world of superheroes from her mother, and she never really wanted to be in it. So she very quickly, it was very easy to quit when they were outlawed in the 70s. But you're right, like there's this huge overarching story of nuclear Armageddon is on the horizon. There's a conspiracy, but we do connect with these two characters that are forming this relationship amidst this world of larger than life characters. I want to say though, when I first read it, and I read this back in high school for the first time, and I've since read it so many times. There was a period where I was reading it at least once a year, but I honestly didn't see that relationship coming because at the start of the book, Laurie is Dr. Manhattan's girlfriend. They've been living together for years on a U.S. Army base. And then he leaves and abandons humanity, abandons her, and goes to Mars. And then she's kicked out of the base by the government because they only kept her around to keep Dr. Manhattan placated. she ends up staying with Night Owl, and then it's a very sweet, very tentative relationship that slowly kind of develops and really, I think, builds in a very realistic way. And like you mentioned, he's got so much self-doubt, and he's just so charmingly nervous around girls, and then he's almost surprised when a relationship happens between the two of them. And it really is the heart, I think, of the story, which is interesting because, like you said, she didn't have much to do because they didn't even add Silk Spectre to the story until much later in the process. And they're like, oh my gosh, we forgot to add a girl.
Yeah, exactly.
I think she's underserved in this story, which is a disappointment because, not to jump ahead too much to talk about the adaptations, but Laurie is by far one of the best and strongest and dynamic characters in the Watchmen TV show. And I think maybe part of that was a conscious sort of apology for how she was served in the original graphic novel.
Yeah, and I wanted to also talk about the Ozymandias and like his plot. You mentioned that certain characters were linked to the Charlton comic characters, right? But like, do you know which character Ozymandias was supposed to be?
Yes. Oh, Thunderbolt, who is not someone that I am familiar with, and Question became a really cool character in the DC animated universe with the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. He was one of the characters that kind of emerged. He's a really interesting character. And, Captain Atom was a big part of that show. So I know those characters from mainstream DC Comics, but Thunderbolt, I don't know that much about.
I see. Yeah, I know. For me, I just thought of like actually the supervillain Brainiac. Is more of a like, or maybe the hero Brainiac. If you try to bring in some Legion of Superheroes kind of vibe to it, it's someone who's actually quite smart.
Well, he's focused to the point that he's also detached from humanity in a way similar to Dr. Manhattan. Ozymandias's intellect removes him from humanity, and he can't be part of humanity because he feels detached and above us and needs to save us from our own selves. And so it's revealed, spoilers, hopefully you've read the book by now, but it is revealed that he is the architect of this entire conspiracy, and he's doing everything for what he thinks are noble reasons.
The fact that he sees himself as like a Christ-like figure.
Yes.
In the end, I think one of the panels, his arms are up and kind of in a Christ-like pose. And I found that was pretty interesting. And yeah,
is this the panel where he's celebrating I did it, and his arms are up?
Exactly. Okay, I'm trying to make sense of the fact that most of the superheroes actually went along with this plan because in the end they were, except for Rorschach, of course. And, he because of his like moral black and white point of view, he can't really deal with it like a gray world, a world that is kind of not perfect, right? So I want to talk to you about why these comic characters actually went along with the plan after they knew the truth.
I think I felt that it was justified, and I think part of it goes back to what we just talked about with the characterization of Night Owl and Silk Spectre. They're very human characters. They did not get into this. I mean, Silk Spectre didn't get into this by choice, and Dan, the Night Owl, didn't get into this to perhaps save the world. He just wanted to make a difference, and try to do a little bit of good in the world. And suddenly they're faced with this completely unwinnable situation, this completely, incalculable moral question of, do we speak out? And then maybe, because the ending is Ozymandias creates a squid-like alien character and then teleports it into the middle of New York City, and there's a telepathic shockwave that kills like 3 million people in New York. And he does this all because he wants the US and the USSR to stop building up their nuclear arsenals and, stop this march towards nuclear annihilation and, nuclear winter. And he wants this shit to shock them into cooperation, thinking that there's, a threat from an alien planet, another dimension. And they put aside their differences, and it's almost immediate that they begin talks towards peace and reunification between the two and armistice. And this can only be maintained and only be sustained by keeping the secret and not revealing the conspiracy. So if Night Owl and Silk Spectre tell anyone when they return to civilization, and if they tell anyone, hey, the alien wasn't real, then it would have been all for nothing.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out why certain characters would actually just want to go along with it, even though there is a greater good coming out of it, right? Like from a just a moral standpoint. And I think in that instance, I kind of saw what Rorschach was, going on about, and with him and him setting up the fact that like sending a letter to a journalist at the end with explaining the plan, and undoing the whole conspiracy. I found that pretty interesting.
Well, that's an important detail.
Possibly, yeah.
Rorschach doesn't know what the actual plan is when he sends off his final copy of his journal. So the book ends with, there's this publication that has Rorschach's journal, and they're thinking about maybe they're looking for something to publish in the next issue, but he doesn't actually know, what's going on. He doesn't know that it wasn't going to be an alien. He doesn't know it was going to be, this fake alien attack at that point. So it would just reveal that there was some sort of conspiracy going on, but not necessarily the entire plot, because he didn't know the entire plot at the time of writing that journal. So it wouldn't necessarily undo everything, but it would cast things into doubt, which plays into the TV series. I do want to say, you never asked me my favorite character, and it's Rorschach. But it's kind of for the same reason you talked about why Night Owl and Silk Spectre are your favorite characters, is because he is so different, and I find him fascinating that he does have such a different, he's not the entry character. He's this, I kind of do admire that he is so strong-willed, and he is so, he buys into his beliefs so much, and he is unwavering. I think that is, somewhat sort of admirable, but he does take it a bit too far. But he is this very tragic hero, and he I think it's more interesting because he is just so, to be honest, he is a bit deranged, but I think that's interesting to watch him. I don't necessarily enjoy the characters that I'm meant to relate to as much when I watch movies or read books, because, Star Wars, your entry point character, the character you're supposed to feel like, is Luke Skywalker. But my favorite character is Han Solo, because he's the coolest. And, I want to hang out with him, or I want to be him a bit more. I want to be the one who takes charge and, does what he means and means what he says. But I'm just looking at something from watching the Watchmen book. I don't know if you've seen this, the original character sketch of Rorschach. Have you seen this?
No, I've not.
It wasn't just his face that had the Rorschach patterns. It was his entire body.
Oh my God. Was he like in a onesie?
Yes, but Gibbons has done this illustration where he's got the trench coat on still, and he's still got his fedora hat, but he's ripping open his trench coat to reveal his Rorschach-ian onesie with all the patterns going across his chest and down his legs. This sort of flasher Rorschach. That's phenomenal.
Too funny. Do you think that Rorschach kind of also reminds you of the Dark Knight Returns Batman?
Yeah, very much, making these questionable moral choices and taking things too far and being too obsessed. And again, fascinating, Yes, to a certain point, it is admirable to believe in your convictions, but at a certain point too, to exist in society and, to carry on living, you have to be able to decide when enough is enough. And that's Rorschach's fatal flaw. He is killed by Dr. Manhattan because he doesn't agree to go along with the conspiracy. And he says, no, never compromise, not even in the face of Armageddon. Yeah, and he's heading back to society to tell everyone, this peace was, paid for in blood. And Dr. Manhattan disintegrates him. But one last thing I want to say about Rorschach, his mask. You've talked about how he doesn't see things in grays because his mask is this mix of black and white, but they never do mix. They never do turn into gray. It's very hard-lined, and it's just such a brilliant visual representation of his entire ethos, his entire moral compass.
Yeah, there's so many layers to this book.
Yeah, man. Oh my gosh. There's so much to talk about, and I just love it so much. I want to talk about the structure a bit, because we talked about the characters, but I really like how there's 12 issues, and it's more or less about half of the issues are kind of driving the plot forward, and then half the issues are kind of these character origin stories, more or less, or kind of deeper explorations of the characters. And does that structure remind you of anything that's been popular in pop culture in the last kind of 10 years? There's one thing that jumps out at me right away.
What is that?
Well, Lost, the TV show Lost.
Oh, I see.
Every episode, we'd focus on a character, and on the island, and it would push the entire larger narrative forward. But then we'd also get all these flashbacks telling us a bit more about Kate or Locke or Jack. And
Mm-hmm.
Damien Lindelof has come out and said, yeah, we just lifted that directly from Watchmen. And I just think it's so interesting that it's now come full circle that Lindelof has created Watchmen, the TV series, which,
Yes.
it takes this kind of structure from Watchmen, the book, but he also already used it in Lost. But I just think it's like I said, there's so much world building, and these issues are a really cool way into really getting into the deeper background, but also the deeper motivations of the characters. And again, Alan Moore, in one of these interviews I've read with him, has kind of admitted that he only really had enough plot for 6 issues. So when he had to fill 12 issues worth of material, he's like, well, let's just spend an issue. Every couple of issues, we'll just look at a character's background. And
Yeah.
for me, these are some of my favorite issues. The Rorschach issue is fascinating. The Dr. Manhattan issue is really interesting, and it gives you a sense of how he experiences time. And each of these kind of character-based issues the style does change up. And I think that speaks to the power of releasing this story in chapters as issues over about a year. That, it still works together as a graphic novel, but it is interesting that these very hard-lined chapter breaks do kind of give them a chance to change the format up from month to month.
Yeah, totally. And I wanted to actually get to the point that, like, have you watched the Watchmen TV show, and how do you think the characters were handled in that show? Plus, of course, we can talk about the movie, and the plot line there. But yeah, what do you think of? I've seen like parts of the TV show, which is kind of criminal.
So I watched it myself when it was first coming out, and then I just last night finished a rewatch of it and watched it with my wife Emma for the first time. She hadn't seen it, and I said, "Hey, I think you'll like it." But it's the interesting thing about the Watchmen TV show is it treats the graphic novel as canon. So everything that happens in the graphic novel happens and counts towards the TV show. So they're not contradicting anything, but
Right.
it really just jumps into, let's check in on this world 35 years later, 34 years later in modern day 2019. And if you haven't read the graphic novel, then, catch up. And they don't do anything really to introduce new viewers into this world. And it's just sort of like they assume what this world is all about. And if you don't, you got to figure it out. And so Emma said when we finished it, she really enjoyed it. It was really well done. And she said she thinks it'd be really hard to watch it without me. So especially the first couple episodes, I had to pause and be like, okay, so Ozymandias was this guy. And, just to catch her up and make sure she knew. And I was trying to explain, exactly how much she needed without giving too much away. But I think there's no excuse for how good it is. It should not be as good as it was. It's insane how well they did. It makes no sense. Let's set it in the modern day. We're not going to give anyone, any catch up. It's up to you to do the homework to read the graphic novel or not. And if you're on board, you're on board. And if you're not, we're leaving you behind in our dust. But it's fascinating. And the one thing I love about it, well, I love many things about it, but just like the graphic novel, it's so layered. There's so many connections, deep history, larger world building. It has those kind of character-based episodes, but also there's just so much going on in every frame. So just like how every panel has so much going on in the Watchmen graphic novel, the TV show has so much going on in the background. And, this little thing connects to this, and this little thing will hint at this, and this little thing connects back to the graphic novel. And so, yeah, I mean, well done. But one thing that even to make it even more, to make it even less accessible, we've hinted at how the movie changed the ending to the graphic novel a little bit.
Yeah.
The TV show goes back to the original ending. So
That's
if
awesome.
you're someone who's only watched the movie, you'll be confused. It's not even good enough that you've seen the movie.
You're like, yeah, the squids are back. What?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the ending of the movie, which I actually thought was a good choice, it streamlined it a bit, because there's this whole, and I want to talk about this in a second too, but there's this whole subplot where there's artists and scientists going missing the whole time in the graphic novel, and then it turns out that they're being recruited by Ozymandias to design his alien squid, and then he teleports his alien squid into New York. But in the movie, he frames Dr. Manhattan and makes it seem like Dr. Manhattan has gone rogue and decided to go crazy. And instead of blowing up people with a telepathic squid monster, he launches a bomb that makes it look like Dr. Manhattan, which I think was a good choice. It connects Dr. Manhattan a bit more into the overall conspiracy. It takes out some of the unnecessary subplots, and I think it just streamlines it a bit. So I did find that as a good choice in the movie.
It was very controversial at the time when it came out. I remember a lot of, of people who are fans of the comic just not liking that at all. But I understand why they did it, because a large squid monster would have been maybe too much for like mainstream audiences to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
But
yeah.
But that's the thing. The film is interesting because Zack Snyder directed it, and he sticks so closely to the source material, almost slavishly. And when he does kind of pull back and do his own thing a bit, that's when I think the movie comes to life the most. And so this change in the ending, I thought, oh, that's interesting. He's kind of, actually adapting it rather than just, filming the graphic novel. And my favorite part, and I literally just watched this while I was waiting for you to get everything ready on your end, is the opening credits to the Watchmen movie, where they set it to, it's this montage set to The Times Are Changing by Bob Dylan, and it just shows the impact that the appearance of superheroes have had on history. So it shows all these famous moments, the end of World War II, the bombing of Hiroshima, and, hippies putting flowers in the gun barrels and protesting the Vietnam War, and how the characters have influenced and changed history and changed reality, and leading us to this alternate 1985. And that's the most fascinating part, is when he really was showing me something different that I hadn't seen before and taking me deeper into this world. And then for the rest of the movie until the very, very end, it just sticks so closely to the graphic novel. And at the time when I first saw it, I really enjoyed it. But I do think that's when the movie comes alive the most, is when he strays a bit from the source material.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I think when I was watching the movie, I thought he stuck to it so well. Beyond the ending itself, I couldn't quite think of anything else that wasn't in the comic, right? And
no, it's all taken right from that page. Yeah.
Exactly. So I kind of appreciated that. I think we also failed to talk about Tales from the Black Freighter and how that wasn't in the movie, and how it kind of also connects everything together within the comic. So it's a comic within a comic, which is like also an awesome concept.
Well, let me jump in with a bit of background, because this is exactly what I was driving towards. I want to talk about that structure of all these sort of ancillary storylines. But in the world of Watchmen, Superman was published as a comic and was sort of the inspiration for a lot of the early superheroes in the 30s. But once real superheroes came into existence, superhero comics fell out of popularity. And in our real world, for a long stretch there, superhero comics were really the only comics you could find that were selling anything, of any kind of notable numbers. But in this world, because superheroes were real, people didn't want to read about them as much. So other genres took off in popularity. And so in 1985, the most popular genre of comics is the pirate genre, which I think is just a really cool, look at how they would have disrupted the flow of media and the flow of history. So throughout the graphic novel Watchmen, there's a character who's reading this pirate comic series called Tales from the Black Freighter, and it does sort of parallel and comment on, and then they do these things where like captions from the pirate comic are layered on top of panels in the main Watchmen story, and it is intersecting with the main storyline in really interesting ways.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a thread that kind of goes through this comic, as well as, the main character of Tales of the Black Freighter definitely is Ozymandias in my mind. And he becomes so marooned and just alone in the end as well, just like Ozymandias. So
yeah, well, the main character is rushing back to his hometown because he knows that this ghost ship is coming to destroy everyone, and he has to become more of a monster than these monsters in order to save everyone he loves. and so he wins, but at what cost? And that's very much Ozymandias at the end. He's saved humanity, but he's damned himself very much.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
I know, we've said it several times. There's just so much in here, and one of the things I love about this book is the main storyline is interesting on its own. For a large period there, on several rereads, I skipped over the Black Freighter stuff because, yeah, I know that it does connect and does comment, but you don't need it to get through the main story. And there's a lot of other stuff, some background characters, some subplots that I do kind of skip over sometimes. My most recent reread, I really slowed down and looked at everything and really, really, really absorbed everything. But there's some stuff that I do just kind of skip over if I'm just looking at this from a more entertainment point of view. Have you ever
Right,
done that?
right. Yeah, I mean, in my rereads, I've done that where I've just kind of skipped over certain subplots and things like that.
Yeah.
And I can say also that after I read the book the first time and I read Tales of the Black Freighter, I've kind of actively skipped Tales of the Black Freighter.
Okay, so it's not just me.
No, no.
What about the background material? So every chapter, which was originally published as an issue, has like excerpts from novels or magazines, or Rorschach's chapter has his psych report. So there's all this sort of material that kind of builds up the world and gives us more background information. And the first couple chapters are the autobiography of the original Night Owl called Under the Hood. And
Yes.
what's your take on these background materials? Do you always read those? Do you skip any of them?
Actually, again, when I read it the first time, I read everything, but then as you know, I would skip over that stuff as I do more rereads of the book,
Yeah.
just because they're very detailed and they give a great background on how the superheroes have evolved since the 30s, and I even actually like those like the throwbacks and where they show the old team, the old superhero team from the 30s as well, and how the new superheroes have kind of taken up certain aspects of them, or how the old team affected the world
Yes.
itself. So it's super interesting. Yeah,
Well, I mean, the two main characters that you've identified with the most, Silk Spectre, Night Owl, they, are very much paying for the sins of their predecessors. And I think
exactly.
this entire cast of characters we're focusing on in the 1980s are very much paying for the sins of their predecessors. So in the 1930s and 40s, the Minutemen, the original group of superheroes, they changed the world forever. In some cases for the good, some cases for the bad, and we're paying for the choices that they made. And these superheroes, this kind of second generation, are reacting and maybe in some cases trying to undo what this first generation has done. And I think it's so interesting that the past very much affects the present. And again, going back to that sort of Dr. Manhattan way of seeing time and seeing the history, is everything is related. Everything affects everything, and everything bleeds into the past, the present, the future.
Right.
The
Um,
sorry, what were
we
you gonna
didn't
say?
talk about the newsstand and how that also links up with everything too, right? What's happening at the newsstand, the characters. I don't recall their names.
So both the newsstand man and the young boys reading the pirate graphic or the pirate comic are both named Bernard, and that turns into a plot point. They've been talking to each other, and they've just been
Hmm.
sharing their views on the march towards nuclear Armageddon. And then it turns out that we're not so different, you and I. We both are named Bernard. What crazy? Here's my
Yeah.
hat.
Exactly. And yeah, it doesn't, of course, end well for them either in the end. But
No, they are swallowed up in Ozymandias' conspiracy plot.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, they're just interesting. There's some side characters that just help the plot along as well. And
Well, it just fills in the world, and they've done
mhm,
so much to make this feel like a living, breathing world and universe. And that part of that is these side characters that are commenting on the main plot and commenting on the main characters.
totally.
Yeah.
So, any closing thoughts from your end?
Well, one thing I want to talk about before we do wrap up
Mm-hmm.
is the covers.
Mm.
And the covers are unique for several reasons. And one of the things I think is really cool is there's no characters depicted on any of the 12 covers. And it's very common in especially superhero comics to have like the hero, the big dramatic pose, maybe a very dramatic angle, low looking up at them, very very mythological, deifying them. But every issue of Watchmen, it's usually a close up of an object or something important to the plot. But also, did you notice that every cover is essentially the first panel of that first page? So starting with issue 1, we've got an extreme close up of the smiley face with that blood stain, and the first panel
Mm-hmm.
of that first issue is a little bit further away, and then that whole first page is sort of the camera floating up further and further away, higher and higher and higher away from that smiley face.
Oh,
The
interesting.
second the second issue, the cover is a close up of a statue over top of a grave with raindrops hitting it, making it look like it's crying. Again, that first panel is a little bit further away, and we kind of zoom out a bit and go into the scene. The third issue starts on a close up of a fallout shelter with that sort of nuclear logo, the kind of three sort of triangular shapes. But there's a smoke steam coming from a vent that is in front of that. And I didn't notice this until watching the Watchmen book. If you look at it, the shape of that smoke makes a skull. So it's very much like the Jolly Roger, because this is when we
Oh,
get
yeah.
introduced to that pirate
Right.
comic book. And the smoke kind of goes over the word shelter, and it's cropped in a way that it only kind of shows the letters HEL for hell, kind of this, depiction of, this sort of hint that bad things are on the way. But another noticeable thing about the covers is the title. It goes along the side of the cover rather than along the top. And being a lifelong comic book fan, do you know why most comic book titles are along that top of the page or of the cover?
It's because it's the first thing you read.
It is the first thing you read, but also in most comic book stores, comic books are displayed on racks or on sort of bookshelves with the covers facing out, but in multiple rows. So you only really see the title sticking out before we move down to the next row, and then the titles are kind of all you can see until you get to that bottom row. But Watchmen really wanted to change it up and kind of go against the grain, so that's why the Watchmen title is going along kind of the spine almost rather than along the top. They wanted to stand out. They wanted to grab your attention as something different. And I just think it's cool that even from that cover, even from before you even turn the page and go into that first page of the story, you kind of know this is something different. This isn't your typical superhero comic. And I just think it's really cool as a way to prep you for, hey, get ready for something different here.
Totally. And I wanted to kind of bring up the fact that the smiley face,
Yes.
represents positivity of being a superhero. And then
Yes.
the blood stain is just a way of commenting on that. Yeah, it's not actually perfect at all. So,
Well, not even. It's. I think it's even more than that. That the smiley face is just the most basic representation. You know, an icon of humanity, of cartoons, of faces, of comics. The most basic. If you boil it down to its basic essence, you've got a face. A very, very, very iconic face. And then we're bringing in the realisticness of that blood splatter. But yeah, not even just the fact the yellow is very important, that it's this very bright superhero-y, very bright yellow, but
yeah, exactly.
just you know taking the basic language of comics and just making it bleed, because we're gonna really really pull it apart and build it back up again and breathe life into it.
Yeah.
One last thing I want to say about the covers, because I really hope if you haven't read it, this is hopefully convince you to check it out, because it is a just wonderful graphic novel. But the version that I have, and I've bought it twice because I've read it so much, my first version, that I destroyed it and the spine pretty much gave out and I had to buy another copy. But the version I have is that very striking all yellow with super close up on the black eye from the smiley face with the blood splatter. And I like that because that's an even more extreme close up of the first issue's cover. So starting with that graphic novel cover, that collection, I'm super close to that smiley face. I go through a few pages and I get to the first proper cover where the smiley face is taking up about half the page. Then I go into the first page of the story and we're zooming out more and more and more. But this has been reprinted so many times that there's volumes that have, characters on the cover, or multiple characters on the cover, and they lose that extreme close up of the all yellow with the one black eye and the red blood stain. And I think it's a real shame because it does take away from that sort of feeling of, you're already in the story by the time you look at the cover.
So, any closing thoughts on this one then?
Closing thoughts. Ah, man, it's just there's so much, and every time I read it, I discover something else, something new. My last reread, I noticed that the speech balloons change as you read the story. There's Rorschach, who's got this sort of gravelly voice, and for most of the story, his speech balloons are very, very rough and very kind of, really kind of warbly. And most of the characters, they have these kind of very angular, very kind of rough, gruff, very they're not very smooth speech balloons. But when you go back in time a little bit to the 1970s, you have this sort of more traditional, very smooth, round, oval-shaped speech balloons. When you go back even further in time to the 40s, when we see the original Minutemen, they have a bit more like bubbly, sort of multiple sort of ovals combining to make one speech balloon, which was kind of the style of the time. And when I first noticed that on my most recent reread, I was just like, oh my gosh, they're telling us through speech balloons what timeline we're in. And I just thought it was such a cool, very geeky, very comic booky sort of, very subtle way of telling you what timeline you're in. And I just love it. So I love that this book just gives back so much. Every time I read it, I find something new. That's my closing thought on this wonderful graphic novel.
Yeah, and for me, Watchmen was kind of an eye opener because
Mm-hmm.
I grew up on superhero comics, and I obviously in the 90s it was like, they tried to deconstruct Superman, they killed Superman, they broke Batman's back, Green Lantern went insane, all these
Mm-hmm.
like plot points were happening at that time, but when I read Watchmen, it was such a deep and eye-opening, as I want to reuse my own wording here, but like it was such a deep and eye-opening book to read, and I like it just changed my perspective on superhero comics. And actually, I'm going to be completely honest with you. The first time I read it, I didn't like it, and then I read it a few more times, and I was like, I get it, and
Okay.
so. Because I didn't like it, I think because it kind of fell out of that bubble of safety that like superhero comics have been to that point. Like
Yeah.
even whatever you think about superhero comics at that time and how they were trying to be edgy and all that stuff, Image Comics, all this stuff like Spawn was trying to be edgy with killing people and all that. But
Yes.
even with that, I think it still fit into this bubble of kind of the superhero identity, and just the kind of cookie cutter superhero world. And then Watchmen came in, and it was complete deconstruction of that. And I didn't like it at that time because of the deconstruction part. I was just like so used to my regular, like, beginning, middle, and end kind of story arcs. Like, oh
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the superhero's going to win in the end. Like, it doesn't matter what he's going to come across, right?
And it's not an empty victory. It's a proper victory.
Exactly. And here it's an empty victory, and the superheroes have to compromise to go along with
Yes.
it. So yeah, I think that I give it credit for just changing my perspective on graphic novels
But
overall.
but I mean, I think you and I are both kind of saying the same thing, that it rewards multiple readings. So for you, it took you a few readings before you kind of appreciated and kind of bought into it. And for me, it continues to reward on multiple rereads because there's just so much that you just notice every time. But I think talking about the 90s splashy, very dark and gritty, grimy superheroes, I think there's a lot of superhero comics that took the wrong message away from Watchmen and thought that what made Watchmen so popular and so enduring was that it was kind of dark and gritty a bit. But that's not what it is. It's taking not just the medium of comics but the genre of superheroes seriously. And I think that's what's lacking in a lot of, in your face sort of hardlined big event sort of, you know, this one matters sort of superhero comics, that it's missing that sort of underlying, really strong, really well structured comic that, you know, is taking everything very seriously, and not like serious like it can't be funny or like, you know, very grim faced, but seriously as like we're really thinking about what we're doing here and we're really thinking about what impact we want to have on you as a reader. So Watchmen, I obviously recommend it and continue to recommend it to anyone who's interested or even curious about comics. Cale, would you recommend this to a new reader?
I would not recommend it to a completely new reader, but
Okay.
as somebody who knows the comic form and feels comfortable with it, then I would definitely recommend it. I've had actually friends watch the TV show and then go back and read the comic just to kind
Ah,
of learn more about the characters, and I think that's amazing because then you're already introduced into that world and you have a rough understanding about, you know, what comics are, and
mhm.
then to learn more about the the characters. And you know, I don't want to spoil the TV show by any means, but Dr. Manhattan plays a major role in it, and if you don't know who Dr. Manhattan is, you know, it's probably a great idea to go back and read about who Dr. Manhattan is.
I would be very interested to see, you know, does it. I would imagine that the graphic novel still holds a lot of surprises, even if you're, you know, looking at it as a prequel. I can imagine that it still does surprise you and still has a lot of twists that would be unexpected, even if you've seen the TV show. But that is Watchmen. Hopefully, if you haven't read it yet, this has gotten you excited about checking it out. It's available pretty much everywhere. You can get it in print and digital. You know, if you're looking for it, please do consider supporting your local comic book store. This is a very challenging time for comics in general, but local comic book stores need our support, maybe now more than ever.
You can reach us at mattandcale.com, or you can check us out over social media and send us suggestions at Matt and Cale Read Comics on Facebook and Instagram. And on Twitter, we are Matt and Cale Read. So that again, on Twitter, it's Matt and Cale Read. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, you guys, and keep reading comics, and we'll talk to you very soon. Thanks so much, Cale.
Thank you, sir.
Our next book will be Bram Stoker's Dracula, adapted by Roy Thomas, art by Mike Mignola, the creator of Hellboy. It is a retelling of the classic movie from the 90s, so feel free to catch up, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.